you were waiting for the police to arrive or the military to arrive, to hear a siren or a helicopter. And that was probably the most awful thing, that they never showed up. It was for about 40 minutes. They kept on shooting and killing people, and suddenly everything died down completely and totally.
And I started like walking, and then I saw my people here. So I checked her from the back saying, "Are you still alive?" And she was like this with the baby inside, and I said, "Are you still alive?" She didn't answer.
3 generations of one family wiped out in an instant. In all, 62 lives gone in a scene that Felix, a journalist, recalls vividly.
Carnage. I think dozens of dead bodies lying around or lying on each other, and some people who miraculously did survive.
The Torah prison in Egypt witnessed many painful torments, much likened to a Hellraiser novel by Clive Barker. It created a dreaded sense of helplessness, unrelenting sense of dread, and mental degradation. The excessive uses of medieval torture from the Mahabeth Amin al-Dawla, or the State Security Investigation Service, Egypt's oldest and most brutal intelligence agency, have been well known in the region. Under former President Gamal Abdel Nasser, the SSI were trained by another current intelligence entity, known also to use excessive acts in extrapolating information from unwilling victims, the Soviet Union's KGB. Nasser had dealt prominently with the fundamentalists for some time during the Muslim Brotherhood period under Hassan al-Banna, even making the Brotherhood retreat underground for years. Recruits of the SSI went through rigorous training, even made to learn the arts of espionage and deception. This made the SSI exceptionally successful in penetrating Egypt's most strict religious sects. So successful was the agency in infiltrating of radical organizations that they would train other countries in the ruthless dark arts of torture and espionage in countries like Algeria and Syria. The Syrian government under Hafez al-Assad had success in derailing the radicals for years, which transferred over to his son Bashar. The ideology of Arab nationalism was fundamental to the country's progression and also to its foreign policy. Egypt began taking a road they had dreamed, port trading with the Soviets, France, Spain, and even the United States. Meanwhile, one of Egypt's most ardent religious scholars and formidable adversaries to the ideology of pan-Arabism, Sayyid Qutb, began openly criticizing the Egyptian government. Qutb's return from the United States reversed his previous thoughts. He became alarmed at the West's unnecessary, wasteful, and illicit ideas of life. With his view regarding the Arab world trying to advance to this lifestyle under Nasser, Qutb became his primary adversary. Nasser had falsely promised Qutb and the Brotherhood after his coup d'etat, using the Free Officers movement to subjugate the British imperialist powers. Qutb had not envisioned Egypt under Nasser's plans, but his own. The theocratic state governed by Islamic law. However, this notion was rejected, and Nasser had used the Brotherhood to overpower King Farouk's government. It was a success. By 1954, Nasser declared the Brotherhood outlawed. Qutb was promptly arrested and summarily executed on August 29, 1966. However, with his death came a sense of unity within the Orthodox in the Arab world. Qutb's execution was universally seen as an act of martyrdom. He dared face off against Nasser, and even though he was killed for it, his power would be felt in his death. Nasserism would face eventual extinction until it was dealt a potentially fatal blow when the palpable nation of Israel saw to the military defeat of not only Egypt, but also Jordan and Syria during the Six-Day War. Key Arab states were relatively free from Islamic fundamentalism. This defeat would witness a sense of dread within the Islamic community as a whole. and the collective disdain for Arab socialist governments and the retribution came from the underground monoliths which grew in silence. By the early 1970s, the Brotherhood had gained traction and grew to many Arab cities. Countries that were free from its questionable ideology were now beginning to embrace it. Syria, Algeria, Jordan, Iraq. Some smaller fervent sects began to grow as well. By the near end of this period, the tilt was beginning. And in 1979, it witnessed a birth which extended to the countries which helped shape its foundations. Saudi Arabia saw radicals overtake the Grand Kaaba in Masjid al-Salam in Mecca. It witnessed the Iranian Revolution, where Ruhollah Khomeini helped overthrow the US-backed Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran. And it also witnessed the capitulation of the Islamic Ummah in Afghanistan with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya, or the Islamic group, was born from its Egyptian universities and were loosely affiliated with other terrorist networks and remained largely on the ground, unnoticeable toward Egyptian society. The core members were from Egyptian universities and recruited heavily there. The group began taking on some notice and gained ground with the Egyptian lower class who wished for an Islamic rule of law. Under Anwar Sadat, these groups began to become more prominent, as unlike his predecessor Nasser, Sadat was far more tolerant toward the religious sector. Soon, many of the university's brightest students would become the Jamaat al-Islamiyya's leading spokespeople, one in which taught at Cairo University. His name was Omar Abdul Rahman, also known as the Blind Sheikh. These events would slowly become to full circle, but not until the final coup d'état. Egyptians have witnessed varying sects of Islamism, and many were the proponents of Qutb and the Brotherhood, whom were unorganized and without structure. Save the Brotherhood, only al-Jihad had been somewhat collected, led by Muhammad Abd al-Salam Faraj, whom led the Cairo branch. This cell was considered the most militant than its sister branch in the south of the country, which were led by the intellectuals. Faraj had excelled in Cairo University, studying electrical engineering, and once worked as an administrator in the school. However, in the dark crevasses of the embedded city of Cairo, Faraj was known as a fervent believer in Qutb's ideology. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was not seen nearly as strict with the fundamentalists and promised actual reform. He allowed many of them to be released from prison throughout the country, a mistake which would later have fatal consequences. Many of the Muslim Brotherhood members had now saw fit to exact revenge on a system which gave them nothing but motivation in regards to their torturous experiences. Sadat also saw Egypt lacking in true political reform as well. It was a simple decision to mend problems between Israel and the Egyptian government, which saw Sadat's final days. On March 26, 1979, just 7 months following the Camp David Accords, a peace treaty which was finally signed by Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin in Washington, D.C., which was moderated by U.S. President Jimmy Carter. The Egyptian fundamentalists, who never forgotten the defeat at the hands of Israel in 1968, witnessed another transgression. Faraj immediately took notice, and other notable Egyptian members, such as Ayman al-Zawahiri, Karim Zudi, and Omar Abdul Rahman, have begun taking the steps to eliminate the threat from the country in Anwar Sadat. Faraj began holding evening meetings with members of the Egyptian military who were affiliated with al-Jihad, later renamed to Egyptian Islamic Jihad. The idea had been proposed to him by Khalid Islambouli, a lieutenant in the Egyptian army whom Faraj had invited to join al-Jihad when he was posted to Cairo 6 months before. Abu al-Zamar, an intelligence officer and member of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, had come on board as well. On October 6, 1981, Anwar Sadat was assassinated as military trucks pulled up next to the podium facade, which was Sadat sitting just behind front row. The Egyptian government now saw former Vice President Hosni Mubarak, who was also injured as he was sitting next to Sadat. However, under Mubarak, he immediately ordered an investigation into the incident. Hundreds of religious Egyptians were arrested, even if they were simply suspected as having any ties to any religious organization, even if they weren't fundamentalist. Faraj was taken into custody and even gave his arresting officers the truth of the matter, bluntly. Faraj had stated, "The basis of the existence of imperialism in the lands of Islam is these self-same rulers. To begin with the struggle against imperialism is a work which is neither glorious nor useful, and it is only a waste of time. It is our duty to concentrate on our Islamic cause, and that is the establishment, first of all, of God's law in our own country and causing the word of God to prevail. There is no doubt that the first battlefield of the jihad is the extirpation of these infidel leaderships and their replacement by a perfect Islamic order, and from this will come the release of our energies." Faraj, as well as Islambuli, Zomar, Zudi, Rahman, and al-Zawahiri, were all detained and arrested for their alleged roles in Sadat's death. Al-Zawahiri experienced horrific acts of torture, for the SSI wanted a final piece of the puzzle. Isam al-Kamari, a decorated tank commander and major in the Egyptian army who was suspected of smuggling military weapons to the members involved with Sadat's death. Al-Zawahiri's painful indulgences of remaining silent were met with cigarettes to the face, sitting naked in a wooden chair with nails and burns on his back by hot irons. It led him to finally set up his dear friend al-Kamari, an act he later admitted in his book, Nights Under the Prophet's Banner, that he never forgave himself for. While in Tora prison, many of those in prison were released after 2 or 3 years. However, Faraj and Islambuli were executed for involvement in Sadat's assassination. While in prison, members of the al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya, led by Karam Zudi, had begun noticing Omar Abdul Rahman had appealed for its emir position. It led to division within the group. Rahman was seen as a fiery leader, Zudi its more stalwart protagonist. Zudi had reiterated that Rahman was blind. He could not be trusted to lead the organization. With Abu al-Zamar in prison, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, now under Ayman al-Zawahiri's leadership, which saw him expelled from the country and saw himself situated in Afghanistan, which was a perfect situation for someone willing to exact revenge on the world in regards to his excessive torturous episodes in Cairo. Rahman was released due to him being blind. He was saved from being physically harmed by his jailers. The country saw fit to release him without charge, for which in 1990 he landed inside the United States and was given a dual entry visa by a consular officer who was actually a CIA case agent. With Rahman under a terrorist watch list, it seemingly didn't matter, as he was able to apply successfully for the visa 4 times. The Jamaat al-Islamiyya, however, saw fit to become unlike the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Instead of returning on the ground and regrouping, they immediately began revamping terrorist operations against the Mubarak government. After the assassination of Sadat and the mass arrest of Egyptians' leading religious figures, Mubarak feared the retaliation from an angry public. Thus, Mubarak began his strict crackdown of known terror cells operating within the city of Cairo. However, Mubarak wanted to make amends with other Arab countries, and he began rekindling political amends with King Fahd in Saudi Arabia. This would begin reasserting Egypt back into the Arab World League, which banned Egypt from his organization after Sadat's deal with Israel. Iraq and Iran had begun the conflict, with the Ayatollah calling on overthrowing Western-backed regimes, for which he called the Saudi monarchy and Hussein governments proxies to the United States. Egyptians began taking on notice under Mubarak as a strategic ally, while the Israeli-Palestine issue took a back seat with multiple Arab conflicts happening. Unlike Sadat, Mubarak saw the Palestine issue as tantamount to peace, and in return, he neglected to meet with Israeli officials. He also was a pragmatist, and by defying the Israeli government under Begin, Mubarak met with Palestinian Liberation Organization's leader Yasser Arafat in 1983. Mubarak knew the key to financial aid was to amend relations with foreign governments and preparing the Egyptian social sectors for improving employment. This in turn would quell the fanatics from Egypt's terror cells who manipulate the poor to gain favor in overthrowing the government. Because of this, Mubarak won the people's favor, and in 1987, he won his 2nd term. The break in extremist violence, however, was short-lived. By 1990, Mubarak continued his aggressive conduct toward the terrorist cells who were vying for new recruits, while hanging around at Egyptian universities. The silence came to an end on November 12, 1990, as 2 Egyptian security officers were wounded in a fierce gun battle against 2 extremists at the Assuat University, located in Assuat Governorate, northeast of the country. The officers had been detailed to the courtyard to act as a deterrent, knowing well that the clerics had been recruiting there for months. Assuat is also home to the most Coptic churches in the country. A half dozen churches were burned in the previous spring in the towns of Minya and Assuat in Upper Egypt as the purge of Coptic missionaries began. Coptics are seen as takfir, which are fake Muslim, to the Salafi-minded Islamists. This conflict led to a domino effect between Egypt's security forces and members of the Jama'a al-Islamiyya. The clashes led to week-long battles to which police arrested 67 members of the group after a clash in which youths threw Molotov cocktails and set a police vehicle ablaze. One such battle with Egyptian officers led to the death of al-Muhaddin, one of the Jama'a Islamiyya's prominent leaders. No longer could Mubarak contain the potential growth of a terrorist activity, so he used the Egyptian armed forces to begin on the defense. Rifat al-Maghrub, an Egyptian parliament speaker who was shot dead while in his car on the streets of Cairo. The suspects, members of the Jama'a Islamiyya, who saw this as revenge for Muhaddin, but it also escalated the conflict even further. Mubarak had struck back and struck down hard, and the crackdowns began over and over. Terrorist operations would extend even further, far beyond Egyptian borders, and in just 2 short years, it would visit the United States in one of the country's most financially proficient and renowned cities, New York City, and the World Trade Center. On February 26, 1993, the B2 level located in the North Tower of the World Trade Center had a gaping smoking hole in which the smoke had flowed in pitch black out of the garage entrance. A Ryder truck outfitted with multiple canisters of urea nitrate was timed to explode. Its objective to lean the North Tower into the South Tower, hereby falling over into Lower Manhattan, killing approximately 250,000 people, according to its mastermind, Ramzi Youssef. However, the North Tower stood fast, and Youssef would be captured, but not before his other associates had also been arrested. They were all from the Al-Farouq Mosque in Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, as well as the Masjid al-Salam in Jersey City, New Jersey, the latter being where Rahman had preached numerous times. The FBI had begun suspecting Rahman as being involved with the bombing, although they couldn't prove it. And by 1995, Youssef was captured in Pakistan with the help of the ISI and the U.S. Diplomatic Services Security Service. Youssef was rather open about his involvement, but Rahman was never mentioned, nor once under interrogations. The FBI, however, deployed a disbarred informant who was supposed to be the primary builder of the WTC bomb initially. His name was Imad Salem. Salem agreed with FBI authorities, but while he lived with the blind sheikh and traveled most of the central states and even the Northeast, he was given a task to record Rahman, in which he met with couldn't get anything of value. The FBI had rented a warehouse in Jamaica, Queens, outfitted with listening devices and cameras, to which the New York Joint Terrorism Task Force and the FBI were constantly monitoring. Imad Salem one day would meet with Sadiq Ali, a Sudanese national and member of the Al-Farouq Mosque. Salem pitched an idea to bomb certain landmarks: George Washington Bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, United Nations, and the FBI building. Sadiq Ali agreed to relate this to the others who would assist Salem in building multiple bombs. This operation would be named the Landmarks Plot, after which the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force arrested while in construction of all the bombs and all the players involved, including the ever-elusive Rahman. This would also include an already imprisoned El Sayed Nosair, whom 2 New York City detectives from the Joint Terrorism Task Force, John Antisev and Louis Napoli, had found out he was also a member of the Jama'a al-Islamiyya and responsible for the murder of radical Jewish fundamentalist Rabbi Meir Kahane in 1990, to which Nosair was found not guilty, but found guilty of other charges. Nosair would be the contact that Salem had to meet in 1992, and whom gave him the idea to bomb the World Trade Center, and later in 1993 to attack certain areas in the Landmarks Plot. Nasser would be found guilty and given a life sentence. On the October 1st, 1995, a New York jury reached guilty verdicts on 48 of 50 counts. Sheikh Abdel Rahman was convicted of seditious conspiracy, solicitation to murder President Mubarak, and conspiracy to murder President Mubarak, solicitation to attack a U.S. military installation, and conspiracy to conduct bombings. With Rahman in prison for having been involved with the landmarks plot, Egyptian members of the Jama'a Islamiyya began to ratchet up their activities. Rahman was well received and adorned by his followers, even from other terrorist cells. This included Ayman al-Zawahiri and a Saudi living in the Sudan for the time being, Osama bin Laden. With the Jama'a Islamiyya being the main antagonist, Mubarak had no compulsion to use extrajudicial violence, even if you were merely suspected of affiliating with people from the cells, causing uproar from an already embittered society. The evening hours of Saturday, April 9, 1994, saw Major General Raouf Kayat of Egyptian's anti-terrorism unit get inside his white Pagurk vehicle in front of his home in the suburb of Giza, only to be met by an array of assailants who threw a grenade inside his car while showering it with gunfire. The car immediately became an inferno, and the death of Kayat was simply just the beginning of a major terrorist campaign against the Egyptian government and Hosni Mubarak. Kayat was a major figure against the war against the Jama'a Islamiyya. With the orders to kill him came swiftly. The reaction was considered daring. Nowhere near as daring as what was in the upcoming plans, however. By 1995, Mustafa Ahmad Hassan Hamza, Jama'a al-Islamiyya's military commander, hatched a plot to assassinate Hosni Mubarak along with members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. The plan was simple: follow Mubarak's motorcade and get close enough to shoot him on sight. With such tightened security, it surely would be a suicide mission. And on June 26, 1995, Mubarak was traveling to the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, to participate in the opening of an African summit meeting. According to Ethiopian authorities, 2 members of terrorists were assigned to the assassination attempt. 2 men directing the operation from an unidentified place outside Ethiopia, and a 9-member hit team that entered the East African country. The attack was foiled by Mubarak's security detail, to which 2 were shot in the process, as assailants tried to block the road, with 5 of the 9 men were killed. Ethiopian security detail arrested 3 surviving members. And according to the British media outlet, The Independent, the motorcade carrying Mr. Mubarak had just flown into Addis Ababa for the opening of the Organization of Africa Unity Summit, had reached a point opposite the Palestine embassy in which 2 vehicles blocked its path and gunmen opened fire on the president's car. As the Ethiopian and Egyptian police officers fired back, Mr. Mubarak's driver was seen to wrench his car across the road and drive straight back to the airport, where the president immediately took his plane back to Cairo. Mubarak was stirred a bit, but not shaken by the ordeal. It showed his steely resolve toward the very entities he had showed no quarter towards. This event, however, would serve against the very terrorist cells with an equally but more pronounced response. They would be shown no mercy, even for their family members. Mubarak had sworn revenge tenfold. Over the course of the next 18 months, led by the Egyptian Security Service, the SSI, they began cracking down on everyone affiliated or suspected to have affiliations with the Jamaat al-Islamiyya and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Even family members of those within these groups were detained. Some were mercilessly tortured in Torah prison and Egyptian police stations. Months felt like years. The ensuing violence from both the state security services and terror cells were becoming aware on Egyptian's most financially stable tourism industry. Egypt relies on its tourist hotspots, from the pyramids to the dunes. An average of 2.5 million people visit the awe-inspiring makes of Ramses' tombs, as well as its multiple aging pyramids. 12% of the country's workforce is here, while also endorsing foreign workers to come and enjoy its benefits. Foreign workers meant taken away from Egypt's more deserving citizens. It also saw an influx of Western citizens taking part in enjoying what Egypt had to offer. It was an invitation, however, for revenge, according to the Jama'a al-Islamiyya, one that would tarnish Egypt's tourism industry forever while showcasing the extremes that terrorist groups born in Egypt would partake. With Rahman in a U.S. federal prison for the remainder of his life, Ahmed Rafai Taha took over as leader of the Jama'a al-Islamiyya. With Hamza in prison, Taha, a loyal subject to Ayman al-Zawahiri in Afghanistan, took the initiative to construct an operation that would affect the country forever, while also placating the Jama'a al-Islamiyya. With many members having previously served in the Egyptian military, some of the high-ranking members devised a plan to hold hostages at one of the main tourist sites located south of the country. Taha had previously threatened U.S. citizens, not just in Egypt, but also in Afghanistan. Back in 1996, Taha had publicly threatened to kidnap U.S. citizens in retaliation for the life imprisonment sentence of Sheikh Rahman. However, a bigger plot had hatched, with one of the hottest tourist sites selected, the Luxor. The Deir el-Bahari is located near the west bank of the Nile River. It is home to many of the country's awesome mortuary sites. One of them, the Mortuary Temple of Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was the fifth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty of Egypt, while being its second female in such a position. The idea was to threaten Egypt's touristic industry, causing the country to enter a repression of sorts and to hurt the economy of Mubarak's government. The temple was understaffed, as per the common theme in Egypt. Poor security detail for its most sensitive industry. Members of the Jama'a al-Islamiyya simply had to blend in and trap tourists in the valley, which was surrounded by its large mountains that overlooked the temple as giant guardians to the long-deceased pharaoh. On November 17, 1997, at 8:27 a.m., Hagag Nahas of ISIS tour bus was driving a group of 30 Swiss citizens toward the temple. He dropped them off and drove away. He would return back in another hour. There would be a number of Japanese honeymooners on this day as well. Meanwhile, 6 men dressed in black security outfits passed Saeed Ahmad Ghassan, a police guard at the entrance of the ticket booth. Ghassan asked for their tickets, and one of them replied, "Here is our ticket," and shot Ghassan in the leg and torso. The temple security began opening return fire, but too late, as 2 of them were killed on the spot, leaving Ghassan indisposed at the gate's entrance. Satako Yamashita was with her newlywed husband when they heard a commotion near the courtyard of the temple. The Jama'a al-Islamiyya members began to corral the visitors and shot at the temple guards, so few, while others hid from the initial attacks. The rifles used were Soviet Kalashnikovs, as well as handguns, suspected to be stolen from a police station, as the planners were former military officers. The echoing of the shots also gave the eerie sounds of impending shock and doom for many who visited the temple. They would act in pairs, often trapping separate couples and shooting them in their heads as they fell to the ground with slumped weight, which also made an insidious sound of impending death to those still alive. The worst, however, was yet to come. Many of the tourists were in pairs and were made to kneel before their armed captors while shooting them at will, one by one. According to some of the survivors of the incident, they witnessed the heads of those shot explode like pumpkins. Others trapped inside the long corridor of the temple hid, some even with their children in tow, as the 6 men showed absolutely no compulsion to whom they killed. Then came the long knives. These were meant for the men, and as some wailed on the ground injured from the initial gunfire, their throats were laid open by the sharp blades of their murderers. Often loud gurgling sounds as they laid in excruciating agony for the short moments of their life, as the blood soon drenched the very ground where many centuries ago the ancestors of the temple once walked. Bodies of the some became the many, and the shouts of pain and torment filled the site and echoed loudly as it bounced off the walls. According to the Washington Post, it soon became a massacre instead of a hostage situation. Quote, After dispatching several people in the main courtyard inside the gate, the killers moved up the ramp to the middle court, a vast open space in which some tourists apparently were killed where they stood. Others took refuge against the wall of a ramp that leads to the third level, which is closed for restoration. The rear wall of the middle court consists of the birth colonnade on one side of the ramp and the punt colonnade on the other. Both colonnades were smeared with gore. A bloody handprint stood out on a sandstone pillar. Walls were spattered with human flesh, including pieces of scalp with hair attached. Blood soaked the sandy floors. End quote. Meanwhile, as the situation became unbearable for the remaining survivors hiding in whatever crevice they could, some hid under the bodies of the dead. The shots rang out to those running, and while they writhed in agony, their assailants often walked toward the injured prey and seemingly enjoyed their disposal before cutting them open, often desecrating their bodies by chopping off fingers, hands, and even total decapitation. The ordeal seemed like years for those who were in hiding. It was in 45 minutes before the carnage was over. Time had literally stopped as the bright sun scorched the blood dry, leaving a painted dark expression on the floors of the temple, a carpet of death. Meanwhile, bus driver Nahas had returned back for the visitors, and according to him, only 8 of the 30 remained alive from the onslaught. As he would drive back before the security checkpoint, the 6 men, some in bloody attire, had blocked the road from the bus going further. They forced Nahas to continue towards another tourist site near the temple. The bus stopped near the access road to the Valley of the Queens, about a half mile from the Hatshepsut temple. Security guards had blocked the road. The 6 men left the bus blazing outright. 3 were killed with the Egyptian police, while the remaining 3 retreated in a nearby cave, ending their own lives. The carnage seemed to have finally ended. The Egyptian security services and police then descended toward the temple of Hatshepsut, where they witnessed utter barbarity on full display that made even the more hardened officers retch. Over 160 tourists that were made witness to the day's events saw themselves become victims. While many remained alive, over half suffered fatalities and gruesome injuries. 4 Japanese honeymoon couples, 36 Swiss, and 3 generations of a British family from Yorkshire, including a 5-year-old girl, were among the victims. In all, 62 were murdered. Some even were seen walking around in a zombie-like state, some without noses, ears, even flayed limbs from the maniacal killers of the al-Islamiyya. The floors ran red with blood, streaking down 100 feet from the center courtyard. Other areas had clumps of flesh. In another area, a huddled group of executed people, huddled and bent their last moments in a frenzied state of shock and terror. Rigor mortis had settled in, making some bodies curled up in a rocking position. The walls of the temple had handprints of blood, which gave an almost hieroglyphic appearance. One body later was found to have been flayed at the abdomen, where one of the killers stuffed a leaflet which inscribed the deeds of why the incident took place. It was the pressure of the United States to release the imprisoned Omar Abdul-Rahman. It was a scene of horror, but it also shocked the entire world over. As the stories came out that 62 people were killed by Egyptian terror cells, it wasn't just a global outrage, but Egyptian society who roared the loudest for true justice. If the original premise was to put the country at a total standstill of fear, it backfired tenfold. Mubarak had promised total and unrelenting justice for the country and its victims of the attack. The victims' families, however, were left with the eventual question, why? The hierarchy of the al-Islamiyya responded in short time with a statement just days after the massacre. Quote, the al-Islamiyya could halt its military operations for a while if the Egyptian regime acts likewise and stops its unjust campaigns against the sons of the Gamma, releases its prisoners, and returns Sheikh Omar Abdul-Rahman to his homeland, and cuts relations with the Zionist entity. For 10 whole years, the Egyptian regime has waged a vicious war in its attempt to uproot the al-Islamiyya from the hearts of the people and sons. Each time the Egyptian regime failed in this confrontation, the result is the removal of an interior minister, end quote. As Egyptian authorities and investigators committed to further the inquiry, they found out that the main antagonist for jihad against the country's government came just 10 years ago, back in 1988. At the start of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Saeed Imam al-Sharif, also known as Dr. Fadl, was one of the primary influences of the jihadist ideology in Egypt. He is also one of Ayman al-Zawahiri's oldest associates and is credited for the beginning foundations of al-Qaeda. Back in 1988, he would also author a book used by jihadists as the manual for international jihad, entitled The Essentials of Making Ready for Jihad. The jihad was aimed at Arab secular governments. Egypt was in the crosshairs naturally. Years after the massacre, Egypt's tourism industry continued to become lucrative, but the landscapes remained pained by the ever reminder of what happened at the temple courtyards of Hatshepsut, to which even Dr. Fadl had completely changed his envision of jihad and denounced terrorism from his position in Torah prison. The very same prison which saw its deep recesses of hopelessness and despair, which fortuitously shaped the mindsets of Sayyid Qutb, Muhammad Abd al-Salam Faraj, and Ayman al-Zawahiri, as well as Omar Abdul Rahman, to which they would commit acts of terrorism and banality against the state and the foreigners who would visit. Would Egypt finally learn its lesson? After experiencing decades of extrajudicial abuse and torture, which helped shape the mindset of extremists in which they were before and when they were not. In 2013, Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi was sworn in along with 17 new governors. One of them, Adel Mohammed El-Kayat, was a prominent leader of the al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya, who was also one of the primary architects of the Luxor Massacre. Morsi, originally from the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood, had also pardoned one of Jamaat Islamiyya's members who was accused of trying to kill former President Mubarak. He has also previously called for the United States to free the group's spiritual leader, Omar Abdul Rahman. It shocked many in Egypt, including Khaled Fahani at the American University in Cairo, who would later go on to say, "It's as if the Muslim Brotherhood is reaching out to the extremists." The problems of Egypt now lie out in the open, instead of the dark cavernous prison tombs.